I would like to open a small door for you, not the warped plank of the old man's shack, where pitch and rope had steeped into the walls, but the quieter door of memory. Beyond it, the sea does not roar. It breathes, like a craftsman bent long over his bench, lifting and lowering the chest with patient rhythm. Come with me not to count trophies, but to meet a man who carried none, and yet walked as if honor were a lantern in his ribs. We will move slowly, as a skiff noses from sand into the first thin water. You may hear me say I, for I am Manolin, the boy who learned to read the world by watching an old fisherman, yet you will also hear he, because the old man was a coast my days kept returning to. If this is a voyage, it begins without fanfare. Only a paddle dipped quietly, a coil of line tested for soundness, the morning star pinned to a paling sky. And if this is a confession, it is that I loved the salt, stiff rituals of a man who refused to be bitter. Our village woke earlier than the light. Grown men warmed their hands around tin cups of coffee so thin it was more memory than drink, discussing the wind's corner, the set of current, and rumors of flying fish beyond the point. I listened for something else. The old man's way of arriving, unhurried, shoulders tanned and narrow, hands mapped with cuts as fine as dried seaweed. He seldom spoke. When he did, it might be about lions at play on a distant African beach he had seen when young, not a grand story, but a private weather vane. The dream returned to him often. He did not interpret it, only kept it like a shell in his pocket. You may have heard the number the village repeated until it lost all mercy. 84 days and no fish. It braided itself into talk at the landing like a taunt or an omen, or merely something to say when nets were mended and gossip ran thin. Day 85, they said, would be the pivot. For him, I think it was not charm but discipline. The next day follows the last. You prepare as if it mattered, because it always does. On that dawn, I wanted to go with him, as I always did, but my parents had put me on a luckier boat. I protested in the manner of a boy who feels his loyalty is a sail that must not be furled. He settled the argument with a hand on my shoulder, a touch both firm and kind, telling me without words, you belong to your folks and to time. The sea will wait. His shack kept its economy like a prayer, tackle repaired and re-repaired, the coils of line snug as careful handwriting, the gaff sharpened to an honest edge. In one corner were old newspapers about baseball, luxury papers for fishermen, but to him a way to keep company with courage. He admired a certain player who played through injury with a calm that never shouted. That story seeped into me not as a headline but as a method. Hold, endure, do the small thing right when no one watches. If there is a definition of honor that does not need applause, it may be the sound of a whetstone on metal in a room with a dirt floor. I worried for him, not because he was old and alone, but because I feared solitude would nibble his resolve the way shipworms worry a hull. I learned that for him, solitude was a craft in itself, a clearing carved in noise where attention could work. He put out before the sky had chosen a color. The skiff seemed suddenly lighter when it left the beach. A breath taken after a long sentence. The lines were set, the baits checked, knots reviewed as if they were promises requiring signatures. The bow slipped into the dark water and vanished behind a shoulder of morning. I watched until the watching turned into imagining. On land, I occupied myself with chores that felt small beside the ocean's scale. I bartered for a little fresh bait, sharpened my pocket knife, wiped a tin cup until it shone, as if that might make water taste like sweetness. Once, when he let me shoulder the mast, its weight surprised me into silence. A humble timber felt like a cross, yes, but also like a contract. I did not know its terms then. Later I would understand that every life hands you something to carry, and you must learn where to place your hands. To ease the heaviness of waiting, I let myself smile at ordinary things. The baker's daughter waved, a streak of flour bright on her cheek, like a careless cloud. I thought of telling him, and feared he would make that small sound, half laugh, half breath, that said, "Children." He rarely laughed aloud. His smiles were tight stitches at the corners of his mouth. I hid the moment away as one hides a coin, to spend when a great fish is landed, perhaps, and we could be generous not only with money, but with notice. Once I slipped an extra pinch of sugar into his coffee, extravagance where we lived, and watched him drink it slowly, as though he were savouring sweetness from an inland spring. Such moments, far from heroic, were the line that tied our long days together. If I examine the compulsion that drew me to him, it is not ambition or speed. I did not want a name among fishermen. I wanted proximity to someone who refused to lie to himself. When he spoke of the lions from his youth, he never adorned it. He did not say they symbolized anything. When he mentioned the 85th day, he offered no oath of victory. He merely arranged lines, sorted hooks, and gauged the breath of water. I learned that the truest vow is a tuned habit. If you are young and hungry for miracles, this lesson is a hard bread to chew. I speak as someone who once choked on it. The landing before that departure kept its ordinary music, timber murmuring against timber, rope whispering over a gunwale, a lean dog snoring by the bait shed. Overhead the sky took on the pearl of a shell's inside. Men guessed about schools of fish like blue streets under the waves. I listened instead for messages that did not shout, gulls describing ovals in a changed wind, the hush between a lukewarm patch of water and a travelling seam, the colour of the sea's skin telling where a current ran. He read these like scripture, and I, an awkward acolyte, practised sounding out the letters. Some afternoons I carried to his shack 2 newspapers so he could consult box scores and debate in a very quiet way about the dignity of playing hurt. He would nod to a name I knew only as rumour, and the nod would mean, "See, the hand can ache and still hold the bat." On a wall hung the outline of the mast's shadow. Every evening it stretched long enough to touch the doorway, as if the day itself bowed when leaving. If there were saints in that room, they were made of wood and salt and patience. There is a detail I must place here because it belongs to the world of facts. The village had begun to pity him. Pity can be a kind of rot, even when it wears a kindly face. I did not pity him. I hated the pity that drifted toward him like soft weeds, wrapping and dragging. He noticed it and did not waste breath on anger. He simply kept himself in repair. That too is a form of defiance, and perhaps the only one that lasts. You might ask why a boy would stand for hours staring at a line of horizon when boys usually run at something brighter. I suppose it was gratitude for many small salvations. How to stow a coil so it pays out clean. How to make a knot that refuses to fail. How to read wind with the skin of your forearm. How to measure yourself without bragging or shrinking. Years afterward, sitting in a city cafe that chilled the air and sweetened everything, a briny draught can still arrive inside me, unasked, reminding, "Look far, be exact, don't dry out. I will not promise you a miracle in the next breath." Stories would be easier if they obeyed the calendar of our want. Before any miracle, if that is even the correct word, there is the plain work of departure, which has its own beauty. I ask you to stand with me on the sand as the water changes color, grain by grain, and learn to be interested in preparation. Honor, in the end, is a braid of smaller fibers, small tasks performed faithfully by someone who will not, even to himself, pretend. When the skiff slid beyond sight, I found that waiting is a craft of its own too. It wants tending. You keep your thoughts from turning rancid by giving them errands. Tidy the hook box, reread a score, carry a bucket, plan a dinner that may not be eaten hot. And you keep your fear in a manageable cup by naming it something plain. I named mine weather. It behaved better when it had a name. Still, an ache remained that was not weather, it was hope, and hope is heavier than we admit. I carried it as best I could, as he carried his mast, and tried to learn where to place my hands. And even so, we still wonder whether honor, left entirely to itself, can keep burning in the dark, or whether it needs, now and then, the brief recognition of another pair of eyes to shine true. The village was a geography of habits before the sun-tar black ropes sleeping in coils, skiffs turned to the tide like patient animals, crates chalked with the names of men who owed and men who were owed. Even the gulls arranged themselves on the rooflines like punctuation, waiting to mark the day's first sentence. I walked among these familiar things with a boy's purposeful fussing, but my eyes kept returning to the sea path the old man had already taken. It felt as if a thread ran from my chest to his skiff, invisible yet pulled taut by the first faint tug of current. When I breathed in, it seemed to me the Gulf Stream breathed out. There were tools my hands had learned almost as a language, thole pins smooth with use, the snug hitches we preferred because they did not slip, the bait box where the sardines silvered faintly even in the half-dark. If you are not from such a place, these details may look like clutter. To me, they were the alphabet of staying alive. The old man had once made me recite them backwards hooks. Gaff, coil, baits, until my mind could recognize them as quickly as fingers find prayer beads in a pocket. I grumbled then. I am grateful now. On mornings when I was not allowed to row with him, my task was to keep faith lit on shore. Faith, I discovered, needs errands. I went to the terrace and bargained for a little coffee, not the thin water we called coffee at home, but the real bitter steam that woke the chest. The owner pretended to be stern about credit, but there is a kind of ledger invisible to ledgers, and the old man's name rested there with interest compounded by kindness. Once, when I carried the tin mug back along the sand, its warmth in my hands felt like I was smuggling daylight ahead of schedule. I set it on his table, though he would not taste it until night. It soothed me to imagine that taste travelling toward him across water. I gathered bait as well sardines for the little baits, a fresh bonito if I could get it for the big hook. Men argued in low voices about where the schools had turned, drawing maps in the air with 2 fingers as though the sea would honour their lines. Someone laughed about the old man's luck and glanced at me to see if I would flinch. I did not. Pity is a cousin to contempt. I wanted neither, visiting our doorway. Instead, I wrapped the sardines, cold and shining, in a square of newspaper and tucked them into a shaded crate for when he came home. If home meant a deck or a bed, we never said. It meant where he could lay his bones down without apology. I have told you that he loved baseball, The morning's paper held scores and a headline about a man whose name travelled like an echo through our street DiMaggio, the Great One. The old man respected him particularly because a bone spur gnawed at his heel, and still he played beautifully as if pain had been taught to be polite. I tried to read the box score out loud in the cadence the old man liked, steady, unhurried. If you think it strange that fishermen listen for news of a game far away, consider this. When your living depends on wrists and luck, it comforts you to know somewhere else a man wins, by wrists and stubbornness too. There was the matter of his shack. I turned its small disorder into a tidiness that belonged to us, not to pride. The mast lay wrapped in its patched sail, a pale cocoon. On the wall a faded holy picture kept company with another of a blessed heart aflame icons that looked to me like water and fire agreeing to share a room. The bed was narrow, the blanket thin. He'd once told me the newspapers made better covers than companions, being less talkative. I smoothed the page that had wrinkled, though I knew tonight the page would wrinkle again in a different shape. Some care is not about permanence, it is a daily vote. Do not think I lived only in solemnities. I am young. Youth tugs at laughter, the way the moon tugs a tide. A boy I knew had taught his dog to bring coins from the surf, a ridiculous party trick that nevertheless made us shriek when the dog surfaced with a shining circle in its mouth as if he were Neptune's accountant. The baker's daughter, who had that comma of flour on her cheek the day before, sold me a heel of yesterday's bread for almost nothing. "For your champion," she said, and I blushed so immediately that it might have been me rather than the bread that had just come warm from the oven. These pockets of light do not oppose seriousness. They keep it from becoming a cave. When the first true light unfolded, the landing became a theatre of returns. A boat slid in with a modest catch. Another came back empty, but for stories that grew fins as they were told. Men measured themselves against one another without seeming to, their voices careful with praise, their glances alert to fortune's tilt. I looked past them and tried to read the horizon as the old man had taught me, not for romance, but for curvature, not for signs, but for evidence. A flock of terns pelted the water sharply, then veered away farther than our usual grounds. A darker ribbon ran through the blue like a vein current. Far beyond that, there was only a certainty in my chest that did not explain itself and refused to be argued down. It was long before he returned, long enough for doubt to practice its monologue. When doubt speaks, it borrows many voices. It imitates your mother's caution, your father's ledger, the sarcasm of boys who are afraid of failing and therefore succeed at nothing. I counted in the voices I had. A box score, a memory of the old man's hands not shaking when they should have, the taste of sugar in bitter coffee. Some debates you do not win, you just continue until the tide changes. He came back late and empty-handed on some nights, and the village sharpened its jokes to a fine, mean point. But on the evening before the 85th day, he returned with a quiet I recognized as readiness. Readiness wears no medals. He stowed his gear with a particular neatness. He chewed his bread slowly. He drank the coffee so hot it made his eyes water and called it good. "Tomorrow," he said, but he said it in the way a man says, tidy a fact, not a promise. I walked with him part of the way home. The street dogs parted around him like a brown wave. He was thin and sun-cut, yet he moved with the feline economy of someone who saves every motion for use. That night I asked leave of my parents to sleep in his shack. They objected, then relented, then warned me to keep my mouth shut about what people were saying. I had planned to keep it shut anyway. I brought to the shack an extra blanket and the bread the girl had given me. He accepted both without fuss, which is the right way to receive a gift in a poor place. Before sleep, he spoke of lions as if he were telling himself a bedtime story he had not outgrown. I understood that to carry honor, you need such a story, one that establishes a beach in you where something strong and playful still runs. He slept. I watched his breath lengthen. Outside the night stitched its black seam along the roofs and tied it tight. Just before dawn I woke him, and we ate a few bites. I wanted to bless him in some articulate way, but our people do blessings with hands rather than speeches. I checked the coils, he checked them again. He lifted the mast and I slipped under it to take as much weight as I could. Once more it felt heavier than its size. Contracts always do. We moved down to the skiff that lay like a word waiting to be spoken. At the edge of the water he paused, almost imperceptibly, like a man remembering the beginning of a prayer. Then he stepped in, and the skiff answered with a small, intimate sound. I pushed him off and stood in the chill wash, pretending it did not make me shiver. He did not look back, he never did. I think he believed that to look back would lend the sea one more thing to take. So I did the looking for both of us until the skiff became a dot, then not even that, only a line drawn inside me from shore to horizon. I held that line like a fisher holds a promise, with patience, with fear, with love, complicated by both. And yet, for all that habit and hope can build, we still wonder whether a single disciplined morning can alter the long arithmetic of failure, or whether numbers, once they harden in a village's mouth, decide the sum before the line is cast. Before a number becomes a curse, it is only arithmetic. 84 is a sum, 7 12s, the tally of mornings and evenings braided together. Yet our village did not speak it as a count, but as a verdict, and they pronounced it with the same final little shrug men use when a net comes up torn. They called him Salaio, the worst kind of unlucky, and though they meant it half in jest, pity calcifies when repeated. I learned how it sounds when a word becomes a stone in the mouth. I learned also how lightly the old man wore that word, as if he were letting a stiff wind cross his face without blinking. It is only a season, he might have said. If he were the kind to defend himself, he did not defend himself. He mended a line. I want you to see those 84 days not as a blank stretch, but as a liturgy. Each dawn he checked the knot sheet bend, bowline, clinch, then fingered the baits as a priest would count his rosary. He read the water's surface for tacks of current, the slight bruise color that means depth, the sugar blue that means light. Sometimes he went far, sometimes he worked the edge, where the green gives way to indigo. Once 3 porpoises followed his wake at sunset. He spoke to them under his breath, not as pets, but as neighbors. Another time a warbler, wind-blown from land, dropped to his gunwale like a leaf. He offered the tiny passenger a place to tremble until a gust permitted flight. These are failures in the record book, yes, but not in the ledger he kept between ribs and tide. I remember the ways we tried to smuggle luck into a house that refused superstition. The baker's daughter, all mischief, pressed a tiny sprig of basil into my palm and told me to hide it under his plate. I did, and the scent made the beans taste like a richer country. A boy I knew claimed he could whistle the wind around. He failed spectacularly, and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Even the dogs participated by sleeping in doorways that made us step over them, which we decided meant stepping over obstacles, which meant, obviously, good fortune. The old man smiled at these efforts as one smiles at the antics of children trying to help carry a wardrobe. He let us try. Then he lifted the heavier end. The terrace took on a certain theatre during those days. Men with good catches told their stories a shade louder as he passed, as if volume could varnish truth. Men with empty holds spoke softer, because a man with nothing prefers not to bruise another's emptiness by accident. The owner would set down a glass of beer near the old man with more gentleness than a beer requires. Sometimes he pretended to be annoyed when I argued for credit. But annoyance is an apron people wear over kindness, so kindness will not be embarrassed. In the back room, the newspapers leaned against one another like tired men. I brought 2 to the shack every evening so we could consult the box scores. DiMaggio, the old man would say, and that single name contained an index of virtues: wrists, grace, endurance, a certain cold fidelity to the craft. It mattered to him that the man had played through a bone spur, as if teaching pain a little discipline. It mattered to me that it mattered to him. There were practical humiliations. Hooks dull faster than pride. Bait spoils. A coil laid badly will snarl in the dark at your next cast like a cat with its back up. Some days he came home with hands laced by fine cuts that bled just enough to sting when washed in brine. He would look at them the way a carpenter looks at a splinter without complaint, as if the wood had a right to defend itself. I learned to keep a little oil for the sore wrists, to scrape scales from the table, to rinse the bucket so it would not bring yesterday's smell into tomorrow's work. The poor are not allowed to be careless. It is too expensive. People asked me whether I feared his bad luck would rub off. I did not. Bad luck does not smear like grease. What rubs off is habit. From him I caught a way of standing that saves the back, a way of listening that saves the day. He did not waste time hating what could not hear him. He did not insult the sea by calling it names when it refused him. He simply rowed farther, or differently, the next day. If there is a heresy against honor, it is resentment. He declined that heresy with more ease than most men decline a second helping. I will not pretend I was never tempted to distance myself from his drought. Boys want shine, we are magpies in salt air. When a boat slid in heavy with fish, laughter stuck to it like scales, and the men are bright then, bright as knives. A few times I worked those boats because my parents insisted, because we needed money that does not smell of dignity but spends anyway. I rowed hard and did as told. Still my eyes kept drifting downshore to where the old man's skiff came home light, and something in me refused the arithmetic that declared him lesser. Numbers are valuable, they keep us honest about weight, length, day, pay. But numbers cannot count the very thing that keeps them honest. My favorite of those 84 days is one in which we caught nothing, and yet I learned abundance. That afternoon, the wind fell flat and the sea went to glass. He sat in the skiff as if seated in a room made of light. A marlin showed itself far off by an indecisive fin, there and gone. Nearer, a flying fish broke the surface and skittered like a skipped stone, chased by something hungry. He watched all this with a stillness that did not equal passivity. It resembled attention being sharpened. When at last he began to row home, the oars moved at the exact speed required by neither haste nor laziness. He came in, stowed his gear, and we ate simply. He admitted the failure as one admits weather. Then, before sleep, he said, "Not to me, but to his own breath, I will go far out." It is not a brave speech. It is the only kind of brave speech that remains brave in the morning. If this sounds too solemn, let me confess that those were also the days I tried to teach myself to juggle oranges and dropped them often enough that the baker's daughter threatened to charge me for bruises. Or the afternoon I raced a friend balancing a sardine tin on my head and lost so badly I agreed to polish his oarlocks for a week. Or the little dog who, trained to fetch coins from the surf, once returned with a dead crab and insisted on being paid anyway. Laughter is not treason to hardship. It is the air hole in the ice. The old man's eyes then were the truest thing about him. The rest of him looked worn the way rope looks worn, fibers lifted, colour burned back to pale. But the eyes remained cheerful and undefeated, the colour of the sea when the wind is right. When people pity you, they stare everywhere except your eyes. When they respect you, they cannot help but meet them. I watched who looked where and learned a map of our village that no tourist would ever see. On the 84th evening, we performed our little domestic theatre again. I brought the coffee, sweetened beyond our budget. He drank it as if this was not indulgence but calibration, the body warming up for a race only the body knew about. We spoke of baseball and of currents. He checked the coils once more with that tiny frown he reserved for anything less than exact. The mast lay wrapped, a clean, pale bundle, ready to be shouldered. In the door the night gathered its salt and laid it across the threshold like a shawl. I asked if I could sleep there. He allowed it without remark. The dream came for him, the lions on the beach, young and at play. If there is a country where age loosens its belt and rests, it is that dream. Dawn, and you already know what followed, the quiet launch, my boots in the cold wash, the skiff shrinking, the long line of waiting coiled inside me. But I wanted you to have the chapter that precedes the chapter, the wrist loyalty of a boy, the daily refusals to make a wound into a weapon, the stubborn, almost comical persistence of a man who holds to the belief that you do not beg the sea, you meet it. Without these 84, the 85th would be a headline without a story. With them, it becomes a sentence earned. And still, despite all those careful rituals and patient losses, we wonder whether misfortune can be outlasted by simple fidelity, or whether a village's nickname, once it hardens like salt on a dock post, decides a man's fate before his line ever sings. That night had the clean, pared-down feeling of a deck just scrubbed, nothing extra, only what must remain. I lay on the floor near the doorway because the air moved better there, and because a boy's body makes a decent doorstop against stray dogs and stray worries. The old man slept on the narrow bed with the blanket pulled to the middle of his chest, the rest of him left to the warmth of August and whatever mercy the night keeps in reserve. From the street came the slow punctuation of boots, a bottle's clink, then the soft closing of our poor neighbourhood's many thin doors. Beyond all that, the sea breathed its unarguable syllable out in, and the shack breathed with it. I had told myself I would stay awake to listen for the moment when sleep's tide would turn in him and carry the lions ashore. But sleep is a quick thief. It took me first, then returned me by degrees, so that I woke into the sound of something like a smile. He was not smiling with his mouth. The mouth remained its spare knot. But his face had released its day grip. And what held steady were the eyes beneath their lids, darting lightly as though reading a script of waves. I knew then the dream had come. The one from his youth, the lions playing on a beach far from our own. He never told the dream as a moral. He told it as a memory. On that night, I tried to see it in the room with us, the warm flank of a cub pressed to another, the spring of sand under paws, the sun not punishing but golden and kind. The word that arrived was not bravery. It was permission. The dream gave him permission to be young, where nobody else would, When you are a boy, you are educated by the sounds of adults sleeping. My father snored like rafters negotiating with wind. My mother's breath flowed as an even tide that forgave the house its lean. The old man's sleep had the small adjustments of a sailor's knot being checked. Loosen, tighten, test. Once his hand rose from the blanket and gripped air with that unconscious strength the sea had trained into his fingers. Another time his lips moved in a whisper I could not hear. I thought of prayers and decided this was a different country. Prayer asks, this looked like remembering how to belong. I have been told since that dreams are only the mind-tidying shelves, perhaps, but I think some are rehearsals carefully disguised. The lions taught him a choreography for the morning, how to step onto a deck as if into a field he had known since before he had knees to bruise, how to meet a force, not with argument, but with form. The crucial thing in the dream, at least in the way he carried it back, was play, not a contest for blood play. It made sense to me that he would honor a great fish later, not because the sea requires ceremony, but because he had learned a long time ago that to meet a worthy other is to recognize its appetite for playfair play, bounded by craft. I wish I could say the shack was visited by a hush that felt holy. Honest truth, mosquitoes knew no reverence and attended to my ankles like creditors. A gecko on the wall made its little chirp so loud in the stillness that I nearly laughed. And the baker's daughter, whose face can now interrupt any memory she pleases, had sold me a heel of bread with a compliment folded into the paper. The compliment preoccupied me so fully I almost missed the old man's hand reaching for the water gourd. I passed it at once. He drank, nodded, and sank again into that younger country. Quiet makes boys theatrical. I tried out sentences in my head. Tomorrow we'll bring back a fish so long it will make the road bend, or I will row until the oars confess it is enough. They sounded ridiculous in the dark, each one begging the sea to overhear and be offended, so I practiced the kind of courage he preferred, the kind that does nothing showy and keeps its balance. I checked the coils by feel, my fingers counting turns as if each loop were a number I would one day need to recite in a room of doubters. I sharpened the small knife until it sang light on the stone. I folded the newspapers flatter than dignity requires, because some kinds of order taste like strength when morning tests you. He stirred some time after midnight and said a name without accent, one syllable, soft in the way men say their first boat or their first love. Not a person from our village, not anyone I knew. I felt no jealousy of the dead or the absent. We all require our stores of the unshareable, images, songs, salt-dried names that reach a hand toward us from a past moment and steady us in the present. My own such store had begun to include the baker's daughter's laugh, the shape of a marlin's far fin on a day of high light, and the slow untying of shame when someone older accepts your help without pretending you are a hero. Once, when I was younger, I asked him directly, "Why lions?" He shrugged in that manner he had of refusing to build a fence of words around a living thing. "They were there," he said. "I remember being disappointed, wanting a symbol. Later I learned that the refusal to decorate truth is its own kind of lion muscle under plain skin. The dream itself may have been simple, the way he bore it was not. He brought back from it not a banner to wave, but a temperature to inhabit. When he woke, the room felt warmer, as if the coast of his youth had briefly mailed us a season. Let me make room for an ordinary scene so we do not mistake the night for legend. At one point the oil wick guttered, and we both reached for it at the same time, knocked elbows, and laughed in a whisper like thieves. I spilled a little water and swore under my breath in a way that would have gotten me cuffed at home. He ignored the swear and tilted the gourd to share what was left. Later, my stomach answered its own question with a long complaint, and he handed me half the bread without looking at me, which is the only dignified way to give food to someone who should have planned better. In a hard life, Grace must learn to be quick and almost invisible. Toward dawn, the world gathered itself. Roosters began their domestic sport. A cartwheel complained. A far-off door banged with the sound of a wave slapping pilings. I watched his face for the moment journeys end and duty resumes. It came with a small sigh, not of weariness but of choosing. He sat up, rubbed his eyes with the backs of his wrists, and smiled a boy's private smile, the kind you can keep only if you don't show it too long. "Lions?" I asked, already knowing. He did not answer, which was answer enough. He swung his feet to the floor and stood with the care of an instrument being tuned. We ate little. He liked coffee as hot as a dare, and I sweetened it carelessly rich. It burned him, and he called it good. The mast waited under its patched sail like a promise rolled tight. I lifted from one end and he from the other, and again the pole's weight was out of proportion to its length, as if speaking in advance for the day. Outside, the street gave us back to the beach. The seam of water at the tide line had the silver look of a coin freshly rubbed between two thumbs. I thought of luck, and decided this was not its country. Work, yes. Form, yes. The living temperature of courage, yes. Before he stepped in, he paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the tiniest room a craftsman keeps between thinking and doing. He took it, then moved, and I steadied the skiff with a hand that wanted to be a vow. I did not make one aloud. The baker's daughter would never hear me vow in poetry. My parents would never hear me vow in defiance. The sea does not take vows, only bodies and skill. So I said nothing and pushed. The hull slid into the dark sheet, and the sound it made was small and right. What I carried from that night was not the image of lions, though I confess I have kept them and visit them often, but a method for carrying any future night that threatens to bend a boy into a smaller thing. Make the room ready. Keep your hands busy with the honest small. Refuse big speeches. Borrow youth wherever you can find it, even if it must be mailed from a beach your feet have never touched. And when morning comes, move as if the dream taught you where to place your weight. Still, even with such careful borrowing, we wonder whether the warmth of a remembered youth can truly temper the cold arithmetic of the day, or whether dawn, indifferent and exact, asks for something fiercer than memory to turn the tide. Guilt woke with me like a small, stubborn cat. I had slept on the floor of the old man's shack, yet by my parents' decree I belonged to a different boat, the one with a neat ledger and men who trusted numbers more than signs. A boy learns that obedience is a kind of weather. It may dampen the day, but you still go out under it. I tied my shoes, and guilt refused to heal. He noticed. He always did. He finished a coil with that tidy twist of wrist and asked after my parents, meaning, "Will you go with them again today?" I said yes. The word lodged like a fishbone, tiny, impossible to forget. He nodded, not judging, only acknowledging the law of a house where meat matters. Then, as if to forbid waste in sorrow, he laid out the day's quiet arithmetic, bait, knots, current. We ate a corner of bread and the thinnest coffee, sugared beyond prudence. I read him the box score from a newspaper pressed flatter than dignity. The great ball player had played hurt and played well. The old man nodded as if an old friend had mailed the single word, endure. At the waterline, we paused in that little room between intention and motion. I will be with the other boat, I said, not apologizing now, only stating a fact, but I will come to you tonight. He looked toward the sea, where all our words sought permission. Good, he said, neither warm nor cold, only correct. I pushed him off. He rowed away, with that spare cadence that makes rowing look like thinking with the body. The lucky boat was competent. Its men were kind as prosperous men can afford to be. We worked the seam where darker water ran like a ribbon. By noon, we had respectable fish, the kind that makes kitchens argumentative in a happy way, while the men compared notes and teased luck like a shy dog. I felt for an unseen thread that led elsewhere. I asked to be put ashore early for an errand my mother had not sent. They laughed and waved me off. Boys chase things, better a chore than a girl. The laugh did not know the baker's daughter. I trotted, then slowed. Excitement has no right to make a spectacle of another man's labor. At the terrace, I bargained for bait. The owner's public face was a wall. His private heart was a cupboard. He pretended to consult an invisible ledger and then counted bright sardines into my hands. They lay on paper like coins minted from moonlight. I wrapped them as one wraps respect, not luck. On impulse, I bought a small bonito for the big hook, spending a boy's whole allowance on a promise. Back at the shack, I practiced tidiness until tidiness became prayer. Coils lay in obedient circles, the knife confessed along the stone until it sang. I set the water gourd where his hand would find it in the dark, and smoothed the newspaper that would serve as blanket when the hour turned thin. I placed the sardines in the coolest corner, like an offering on an altar that has no priest. If this seems theatrical, remember the poor cannot afford expensive rituals. We invest reverence in order, evening folded along the roofs. Boats returned with their various histories, some loud with weight, some light with lies told so earnestly the truth had to smile. I looked past them for the skiff that was still a sentence being written. Pity knocked, wearing its patient face. I barred the door. He would come when the sea let him go. Meanwhile, I ate a heel of bread gifted by the baker's daughter and thought unwisely of flour as omen. He had taught me to distrust omens that flatter. He came in late and empty, the skiff tired but unashamed. We did not dress emptiness in adjectives. We stowed gear, split bread, drank coffee that burned and called it good. I read the score. He read the wind, which had its own quiet grammar. Tomorrow, he said, and meant tide. While he slept, the vow began quiet as a current under chop. A boy thinks vows are speeches, but vows are errands you repeat until they become yourself. I chose mine. I would bring bait before dawn. I would shoulder the mast at dusk and daybreak, letting its weight teach my back the grammar of endurance. I would keep the knife honest, the coils precise, the debt at the terrace paid before the owner had to clear his throat. I would read him every score as if courage listened in the walls. I would learn the water as he knew it, not as romance, but as evidence reading for seam and temperature and that faint bruise color that means depth. There was still obedience owed at home. I arranged it inside me the way two nets share a narrow boat without snarling. I would obey until I could afford the cost of disobedience without making my parents poor. Meanwhile, I would bend my days so that their shape touched his days wherever possible. Duty is not a straight line, it is a braid. Before first light, I woke him with a hand on his shoulder. and he returned from whatever beach his lions keep. We ate little. He lifted the mast. I slid under it gladly. It felt heavier, as if it had drunk from the night. At the shore, the seam of water shone like a newly rubbed coin. He stepped in. I steadied and pushed. The sound the hull made was small and right. He did not look back. I did not ask him to. I went to the other boat because I had said I would. We made our modest circuit and filled the boxes respectably. The men were pleased. Satisfaction has a volume the poor can hear from far away. Yet beneath it a softer music persisted, the key of my vow, teaching my hands the notes of help. When I returned that evening, the shack already knew me. I set down sardines, bonito, and coffee. The room set down my worry. I understood then that promises grow best when planted in tasks simple enough to survive weather. You water them by doing them again. And, still even with errands chosen and a boy's stubborn heart enlisted, we wonder whether fidelity from small hands can mend the torn net of an old man's fortunes, or whether love, like current, obeys a geography of its own and carries us where it pleases. He went out alone before the wind had a chance to choose sides. The skiff slipped past the moored boats and the pilings like a thought that does not ask permission. I watched from the shallows until water took him from the eyes and left him to the mind. After that, what I know of his morning I know by two roads, what he told me later in a voice that made no boast, and what I have learned to supply by the grammar of habit he taught me. Between those roads the day becomes clear. He set his baits carefully, not a ritual, but an arrangement of respect. For the shallow hook he used a good sardine, firm and bright. For the deeper, a fresh bonito I had bought dear and wrapped as if it were a small silver book. The lines went out at measured length, each with its sinker and swivel, spaced the way a careful man spaces his hopes so they will not tangle each other. He did not fish the surface like a boy skimming for luck. He placed his confidences at depth 40 fathoms, and deeper where the water is cool and the big ones travel in their own weather. Birds wrote the first lines of the day. A man-of-war bird kited far out, high and economical, the way true professionals work. The old man watched it the way one listens to a trusted rumour, not credulous, not dismissive. Closer in, petrels stitched their invisible seam, their needle feet tapping the water's face. When a small flock of terns dropped suddenly and rose, he turned his head slightly, registering without clutter. The sea is a newspaper that never finishes printing. He read it as it arrived. A Portuguese man-of-war paraded by Agua Mala, bad water, that showy float of violet and glass dragging its long stinging train. He disliked them without hatred. He had the fisherman's plain contempt for a thing that catches the unwary and makes pain feel like punishment. He let it pass. Nearby, a flight of flying fish escaped the dark by becoming brief birds. A dolphin, not the circus kind, but the green goldfish that hunt fast. Water cut its letter through the blue. The old man spoke a courtesy to it, the way he had always spoken to creatures who shared his shift. Go where you must. I am going where I must. He rowed steadily, no slack in the stroke, no waste in the return. Here the Gulf Stream shouldered under him, warm and muscled, moving north like a rumour of a different climate. The oars made their small, healthful sound. The hull answered, loyal to the hands that had kept it simple and sound. People imagine loneliness as an absence, a hollow. He knew it as a room in which everything unnecessary had quietly excused itself. In that room, the mind can hear. He ate half the small lunch I had wrapped, bread, a sliver of cheese, the kindness of a sweet onion, then saved the rest for a later hour that might make better use of it. I love this about him, how he rationed pleasure as judiciously as bait. A man who spends all sweetness by noon has taught the afternoon to be bitter. He would not teach the day that lesson. Mid-morning, the first certain sign arrived. The line at 40 fathoms changed its talk. A good fisherman does not rely on sudden violence to announce a great fish. The old man felt a change in weight, a live trembling, a purposeful curiosity down in the cool. He let the fish taste, then let it taste again on the next bait down, offering the menu in a sequence he trusted. When at last the fish turned, the line began to pay out in a clean, decisive glide that erased doubt. He held the rope and felt the truth of it through skin and cord and bone, heavy, noble, not a frantic thing, but a creature that had element on its side and confidence in its length. He thought, as he would tell me later in a voice without ornament, at last he did not strike. He did the rarer discipline. He let the fish tow him, the skiff like a bead on the great thread of its will. He braced the line across his shoulders so the pull would belong to the body's strongest geometry. The rope bit. The skin burned. The old ache at the base of the neck woke like an old dog, stretched and lay down to stay. He shifted a half inch, then another, the most important inches in the world, so that pain and strength could live together without making war. The skiff began to move, not with the slap-chop hurry of a small catch, but with the smooth remorselessness of a train that has decided distance in advance. On shore, I performed my little day, and if you had seen me, you would not have recognized in my errands the map of a battle being followed. I bartered for more sardines, as if they were talismans, which they are not, and for coffee, as if it were medicine, which it is. I tidied the shack as if precision could travel across water, which perhaps it can in the same way a prayer travels, not as a force that moves things, but as a posture that makes someone ready. I even tried to repair the handle of his old knife and blistered my thumb, which the baker's daughter noticed and bandaged with such efficiency that I nearly promised to marry her. I did not. I am brave at sea and a coward in kitchens. Out there, time slowed into the true hour, the one that work keeps. The sun climbed and settled. The fish sounded and rose, testing both rope and man for fraud. There was none. Once a school of albacore crossed the skiff's shadow-like punctuation. Quick commas of silver. He did not allow himself to think of them as consolation. Consolation is for afterward. In the middle you have only the truth of pull and give. He talked to himself then, not to be dramatic, but to keep language in practice. Steady, he said to his left hand, which sometimes failed him. Kind, he said to the right, which sometimes overdid its gifts. He promised the fish respect and meant it. When thirst asked for attention, he let the gourd guide a mouthful into his mouth, then washed it around the salt-bitten places before swallowing. He chewed a scrap of the bonito to remind the stomach what to do. He promised himself to sleep in pieces later, if the fish permitted. He smiled this part, I know, because he admitted it with the smallest shame when a pair of porpoises ran flanking like good comrades, cheerful and indiscreet. Go on, he said, I am occupied. The line cut a shallow wound in the shoulder. He shifted, made a pad from a rag, and thought of the great ball player with the scarred heel. You would play on, he told the imagined companion. So will I. Then he corrected himself because he disliked comparing games to work when work was at hand. "We will both continue," he said, and the grammar felt fairer. By late afternoon the fish had learned him, and he had learned the fish. It was a long fish, powerful more in endurance than in tricks, a perfection of muscle and intention, knitting its element to its purpose. The old man felt admiration in the honest way one good craftsman admires another, nothing stolen by envy, nothing blurred by need. He thought of how he would praise it when it finally showed, and how he would apologize for the necessity that would follow praise. "I would not harm you," he told it, without moving his lips, if hunger and the proving of myself did not require it. Then he amended, "Not hunger, I have eaten." The proving, then. He disliked even that. Proving is what boys do. Men do their work. He told himself to use better words later, if later came. Evening came for me like a hand on the shoulder. I carried my errands back to the shack. I set the sardines where coolness gathered and folded a blanket along the bed's foot. I read the box score to the empty room in the cadence he preferred, believing, foolishly or not, that sound could make a bridge over water. I stepped into the lane and looked east, where night pushes first. Far out, too far for a boy's eyes, a skiff travelled behind a moving fact. I could not see it. I believed it. A neighbour asked if I would join a game of street ball. I swung a stick twice and missed twice because my hands were rowing some other distance. We laughed, and the baker's daughter called me Fisher of Air. I bowed and surrendered the bat. It is good to be clumsy on land sometimes, to remember where you are supple and where you are not. I carried water, then waited, which is a carrying of its own. He did not come back that night. The village made its little calculations and shrugged. I made my bed on the shack floor and left the door ajar to the sea's breath. If worry tried for eloquence, I answered it with chores. I tied and untied a knot until it behaved like a thought that has agreed to be quiet. I told myself a boy's stern lie. He is not alone while I am awake. I failed at the lie by sleeping, finally, with my hand on the mast as if hands could travel. And still, even when a man knows his water, when his lines are true and his mind does not frighten, do we not wonder whether solitude is a cost or a currency, and whether the sea, which pays so strictly in proofs, ever grants a mercy not accounted for by skill? The sea keeps a language older than our nets, and the old man taught me its alphabet letter by letter, never pretending poetry where grammar would do. Signs, he said once, when I foolishly called them omens. Omens are what men invent when they are tired of learning. So I learned. I learned to read the wind's slant, the way a reader learns italics, to hear a change in chop as if punctuation had shifted from comma to colon, to smell the faint iodine of torn weed as evidence that a rough hand had passed beneath the surface not long ago. From the shore, I practiced where a boy can. I mapped the morning by gulls. Gulls gossip. They will tell you loudly what is obvious to them and very little else. Terns are more exact, sharp quills that stab only where bait breaks the skin of water. When they turned and stitched the air in tight, repeated jabs, I marked the places on a slate. Small fish bullied upward, larger citizens just below. Far higher, when a frigate bird or man-of-war hung almost motionless, tail twitching, I tried to remember the old man's caution. The frigate is a thief who steals what others have worked. Follow him, but don't adopt his ethics. This, too, was a sign. He told me about cloud scripts. Low scud beating itself to grey froth means short temper. Feathers far aloft, a cirrus more delicate than speech, tell of a change gentler and more certain. Once he made me close my eyes and name the wind by cheek alone, a school exercise that felt like magic, until attention made it ordinary and therefore trustworthy. The trades had their names and moods. A land breeze lies, a sea breeze tells the truth in a language the skin learns before the mind. There are colours the water keeps for those who stay. The green you would trust with your children's feet, the blue that tempts you farther. The bruise colour old men call it purple, boys call it depth that warns of weight. We had our own names that would embarrass a map. Where the stream pushed past, the blue grew adolescent and sure of itself, and lines sank clean to the temperature where big fish travel with purpose. I learned to love that boundary where cool respect meets warm appetite, the seam a fisherman watches the way a chess player watches the center squares. Sargasso weed means company, a scattering of yellow-brown with tiny grapes clinging. It collects small life, and small life is a promise, written very small. The old man would nose along its edges, not for luck, but for the fact of shade, bait, and shade again. Once he brought home a scrap of board polished as if by a giant tongue. Storm somewhere, he said, and we both looked seaward as if the horizon might cough up a story to match the artifact. Another time a warbler, wind-pushed from land, dropped delicate and trembling onto his gunwale. He offered it the quiet of his boat for an hour, then watched it lift and fail and lift again. He did not humanitarianize the episode. He simply reported that it had happened, and that for a while the skiff had carried two lives who owed each other nothing and behaved honorably anyway. I learned the meaning of smell, not stories, but proofs. The sweet metal reek where bonito have been cutting. The cucumber clean scent of turtle when they come early in the season. The bitter chemical line that follows an agua malada Portuguese man of war. Violet bladder like a porcelain slipper. Dragging a danger longer than a funeral. I learned to hate those stinging veils without becoming their enemy. Hatred makes you clumsy. He kept a stick for them, not out of rage, but practicality, the way a house keeps a broom. He taught me to separate sign from superstition. A lucky shirt only postpones laundry. A well-tied clinch knot actually keeps the hook honest. He let the village practice its theatre charms, spat phrases, the deft ways men pretend they can talk the sea into benevolence. At home we kept quieter rules, sharpen the gaff, check the splice, mend today what tomorrow might test. If someone pressed a sprig of basil into my hand, and someone often did, I thanked them in the currency of courtesy and hid the sprig under the plate, not because it would sweeten our luck, but because it would sweeten the beans. He also spoke of the stream's moods the way a teacher describes a friend who will never be simple. Sometimes it slides north like a rumour of a better country. Sometimes it shoulders the boats as if to steer them. Sometimes it laughs at men by laying the water flat and glassy and unclimbable. When the fish travel in it, they wear the stream like a highway's anonymity. You may think you have chosen, really, you are being carried. The old man navigated that paradox with the craft of someone who has stopped arguing with gravity. He placed his baits at 4 distances, 4 depths, 40, 60, 80, and a little deeper, each at a length measured not by guesswork, but by a system of knots. If a teacher had put chalk to slate, he could not have drawn straighter. On land, I kept up my less heroic learning. The baker's daughter discovered that if she clapped twice, the shop cat would leap onto the counter and sit, as if auditioning for sainthood. She clapped. I laughed. The cat ignored me with the indifference of royalty. A boy tried to whistle wind again and succeeded only in summoning a dog. Another offered to sell me a charm 3 fish scales, sewn in cloth guaranteed to make the old man's line sing. I paid him with a chore. Scrub the shack bucket until it apologized for yesterday's smell. He did, and we both learned the same lesson through different doors. Work outperforms magic. The day the big fish took his line, this is the old man's day. Not mine. He later told me that the sea had been busy writing small, clear sentences since morning. A dolphin fish, the true green-gold kind, had cut the water ahead. Petrels had quartered where a current sheared. The line at 40 fathoms had kept a subtler music, the low hum that is not quite weight, not quite drift. He is not a man who uses metaphors when a rope will do, but he said this. It was like hearing a good violin tune itself before a concert. Then the concert began. When the fish at last took and turned, the line paid out smooth, not in evasion, but in declaration. He set his shoulders to its honesty and let himself be towed as a man allows himself to be kept by a task that proves him truer than his own talk. From shore, I rehearsed the script of signs to keep faith from becoming theatre. I looked for that far quivering no, too small to see. I watched the birds draw their precise arguments and sided with them silently. I swept the shack, set the gourd to cool, sharpened the knife until it shaved a curl from paper, and folded the newspapers for a night that might demand a blanket more than headlines. If I allowed myself a piece of theatre, it was reading the day's box score aloud to the empty room, steady and calm, because cadence breeds steadiness, and a boy must plant steadiness wherever the soil is willing. The villagers, who are not unkind but are very mortal, practiced their own signs, a shoulder shrug that means so it goes, a joke brightened to a point that can hurt if you wander into it, a glance away from the eyes of a man they have decided to pity. I studied these as carefully as I studied currents. It helps to know the weather on land as well as at sea. What I loved most in his teaching was that he refused to lie to himself about what a sign could do. A sign can indicate, it cannot guarantee. A bird can mark where bait rises, it cannot promise where honor lives. A seam can show current, it cannot predict courage. The hand still has to learn how to hold the rope without shaking, the back how to bend without breaking, the mind how to keep company with pain without promoting it to tyranny. When I asked for shortcuts, he offered me knots. When I asked for omens, he handed me a stone and told me to hone a hook. Yet even with so much learned letters, grammar, or the whole primer of the seal, still wonder whether reading the world precisely can ever protect a man from its surprises, or whether the truest craft must include a bow to what cannot be read at all. He told me, later and without theatre, that the first true sentence of the great fish was not a jerk, but a glide. The line did not leap, it leaned. There is a way heavy life declares itself through cord and bone. A calm taken up by the rope, passed into the shoulders, translated by the spine into a fact the mind can finally accept. He had set 4 baits at their measured distances, and it was the deep one that began to write. He gave the fish what a serious guest requires time to taste, time to decide, then felt the turn, the clean moving away, the skiff pivoting as if the sea itself had shifted its chair. He did not strike. He adjusted, fed line from the coils with a generosity earned by practice, and let the great fish tow him out as if attaching himself to a thought that would not be hurried. He set the rope across his back so the body's architecture could earn its keep. Hands took their assignments, the right steady and kind, the left asked to behave after its recent habit of cramping. The rope burned first skin, then the old stories just beneath skin. He moved a finger's width this way, then that, the difference between pain and wreckage. The skiff, obedient and small, became a bead on the long thread of a will that lived far below, and moved in its own weather. He spoke, but not to the air. He spoke to the fish with that plain courtesy he reserved for equals. Not flattery, not challenge, only acknowledgement. He told it he respected its size and hoped it would not embarrass him by dying before its strength had the chance to fully declare itself. He promised to stay with it as long as it stayed with him. Then he confessed this later, with a smile that was part apology. He wished aloud that I were there. He missed my hands, my clumsy readiness, my habit of handing him water before he asked. It is a foolish bliss, being needed. It warms a boy's ribs better than the sun. The fish kept a course as if it knew both the stream and the argument of its own body. It did not panic upward. It did not dive recklessly. It towed at a speed a man can live inside. Ours looked at each other and agreed to change places. Birds came and went, telling their small gossips. A pair of porpoises escorted for a time, busy and bright, then peeled off on errands less serious. He ate a scrap of the bonito I had wrapped, washed a mouthful of water around the wounds the rope had written on him, and thought of a ball player who played through damage as if damage were only another thing to manage. Pain, he believed, could be taught manners. On shore the day made its simple noises. I bartered more bait as if faith could be counted by the dozen. The terrace owner shrugged in the direction of mercy and slid a little coffee my way with mock annoyance. I tried again to juggle 2 oranges behind the shop while the baker's daughter laughed and then kindly pretended not to watch, which is a particular politeness that makes failure easier to taste. A dog in our street found a crab and argued with it noisily, and the crabbing, a crab argued back. Life on land kept practicing its minor victories. None of it betrayed what the water was writing just beyond our sight. Afternoon slanted. He told me the sun fell to starboard, then ahead, then ceased to matter except as a schedule of thirst. The fish did not show. It towed. He answered by becoming a shape made for towing, knees braced, back bowed to the exact degree that would last, wrists quiet, mind arranged around a single, glowing center where everything unnecessary had gone to wait outside. When his left hand cramped, he promised it ease later, and, because he hates lying, kept the promise in advance by softening the grip and recruiting the right to a little extra kindness. He watched for signs, those honest pieces of grammar the sea allows, and did not mistake any of them for prophecies. He told the fish it could pull him as far as it needed without losing his company. He told it, in the privacy of a mind that despises bragging, that if the fish were the size he suspected, it would be the largest he had ever asked the day to permit. He told it, and himself, that what would happen at the end would be done cleanly. He may have promised the fish an apology. He is that sort of man, able to praise and to hurt in the same breath without confusing the two. Evening made a decision and joined them. The line hummed with a song you can hear only when your body is the instrument. Out there the horizon had been erased. In here the skiff and the rope and the pull and the breath were the whole world. He ate a little more and thought about sleep in pieces, the way a man sleeps on a night train, 1 minute surrendered, 1 minute reclaimed, if the fish would allow it. He loosened his belt a notch so the body could honor the work without becoming its enemy. He spoke to himself the way one speaks to a child in a storm. Steady, love. We are all right. Do one true thing at a time. I read the day's box score to his empty room that evening in the cadence he liked, as if rhythm could lay a bridge over water. Then I stepped to the lane and tried, uselessly, to catch a rumor of him in the dark. a dash of phosphorescence, a gull's late complaint. The village made its small calculations and went indoors. I spread the blanket on the shack floor, left the door ajar for the sea's breath, and argued with sleep until sleep won. It is vanity to claim watchfulness will keep another from harm. Even love must blink. He woke into the second half of the night, bent around the rope like a bow. Stars had taken their places. A fish smaller, green gold, curious, ran alongside for a stretch as if a squire attending a knight. He kept his attention where it belonged. When a sudden lurch announced a change in the fish's minder sounding, a test, he let the line go to the fingers counting and no farther. A mistake now would not merely lose a fish, it would betray the day's whole argument. He refused betrayal of the fish or of himself. He told me that at some point, almost without his permission, love visited. Not sentimental love, the other kind, lean and exact, that arrives when you meet a worthy shape fully and discover you do not want it diminished by clumsiness, even your own. He admired the fish's endurance the way a mason admires a wall that will not false plumb. He said aloud, almost laughing at himself, that he needed me for the gaff and the cheering. He said to the great thing beneath him that he would stay until the words "I'm sorry" and "thank you" had the same taste. And then a little mercy came, not in the form of easier work, which the sea rarely offers, but in the form of companionship from very far away. He thought of lions, yes, the young ones on the beach of his youth, and felt the body remember a rhythm that is not purely struggle. He did not close his eyes. He allowed the memory to warm the night by 1 degree, then returned to the rope's news. This is how a man borrows youth without lying to the day. I tried before sleep. A boy's prayer that I am not proud of and will not recite here. I will say only that it contained coffee, a blanket, and an alive old man. The sea, which is not moved by lists, breathed its steady syllable outside the door, and my hand, traitor to my intention, went slack. In the morning that followed, another part of the story, which belongs to the next telling, the fish would change its mind and show itself. For now, hold with me this long, disciplined being, together, a skiff towed by a creature that would rather tow than be known, a man who chose to be towed rather than to pretend, a line that sang with their bargain, thin as a violin string and just as eloquent when drawn. I add, so you will know I am not all solemnity, that the day after, when I tried juggling again, I kept them aloft for 3 whole beats before catastrophe, and the baker's daughter applauded as if I had played a symphony. These small, ridiculous triumphs are a counterweight. Without them, the scale breaks. And yet, for all the care and respect and the clean, stern joy of worthy opposition, we still wonder whether a bond forged in struggle can survive the moment of victory, or whether the instant a gaff touches greatness, it becomes something less than what both adversaries loved. He told me afterward that endurance has a shape, and that night he wore it. Not the heroic posture we sketch for statues, but a humbler geometry, knees set, back bowed a careful degree, rope riding the shoulder where bone can help carry what muscle alone would squander. Solitude, he said, is the workshop where that shape is plain to fit. The skiff went on at a pace that respected breathing, and beneath, the great fish towed with the self-possession of something that had never once needed to hurry. He had learned not to quarrel with the rope. It bit. He shifted. It burned. He made a pad from a rag and eased the bite into a bearable tooth. His left hand betrayed him, the old cramp that turns intention into a claw. He spoke to it as one speaks to a friend who is late but expected. "Be kind," he said, and waited, and because waiting is not nothing, he arranged his strength around the failure without cursing it. The right hand, which had always been reliable to a fault, took a little more of the burden and did not make a fuss. "Did you talk to yourself?" I asked later, half teasing. He nodded, unembarrassed. "You speak aloud at sea not to produce drama, but to keep your thoughts from hardening into silence." "Steady," he told his breathing. "Gentle," he told his shoulders, for he had learned gentleness outlasts force. He apologized to the fish for the delay occasioned by his treacherous hand. "I am old," he told it, "but the rope is honest, and so am I." The line hummed an unchanging note, as if reminding both of them that provocation was not on the program. A school of albacore crossed his wake, commas of silver in the late light. He hooked one cleanly as much to mark the truth of his profession as to feed himself, and killed it quickly with a practiced tap. He cut strips and ate them raw, washing the salt with water ladled carefully from the gourd. "Good," he said aloud, and he meant it. Nourishment, even in a poor form, can be a kind of courtesy the day extends. "I wished you were there," he told me, and I admit my ribs warmed at that admission, like stones set near a fire. Land had its own night. I argued the terrace owner into trusting me with more sardines and a little extra coffee, and he performed his pantomime of reluctance as always, rolling his eyes heavenward as if the saints kept a ledger. Behind the shop, the baker's daughter attempted to teach me to keep 2 oranges aloft while reciting the day's prices. I discovered the hand's limits and the mouth's, and she laughed with the soft cruelty that forgives as it wounds. A dog found a length of rope and paraded it like a prize. I took it as an omen and then scolded myself with the old man's phrase, "Not omens, signs." The cat on the counter blinked once, which I accept as agreement. He said there was a moment when the left hand, insulted by salt and duty, clenched into a stone. He let it be stone a while. A stone can still hold a rope, he told it, and kept the line across the shoulder where silence is strongest. The fish sounded down and away, a considered descent. He gave line deliberately, counting with fingers and breath so as not to be tricked into waste. A sudden lurch put a fresh slice across the right hand. He looked at the blood, as a carpenter looks at sap regretful, unalarmed. He washed it in the sea, which is good to wounds and bad to pride. When the stars took their correct places, the body allowed the smallest sleep in pieces, eyes half closed, while the hands stayed married to their task. He snatched such minutes the way a sparrow steals at a crust, quickly and without apology. Once, a dolphin fish, our true dolphin fish, green gold and irritable, and beside him for a while, like a frivolous escort, and then dashed away on business. He did not let cheerfulness invade his discipline, but he permitted it a chair at the edge of the room. He told me he thought then of a ball player with a heel that would not behave, and found himself smiling at the fairness of trouble. "You play hurt," he told the memory of the man. "So do I." He forbids himself melodrama. Even alone he prefers plain speech. Pain, he maintained, is a poor king but a decent schoolmaster if you insist it keep hours. Sometime toward morning the world turned pale as a throat clearing. The fish altered depth, as if to test whether the skiff had learned obedience. The skiff, having no pride, obeyed. He promised his left hand coffee, which is a kind of faith, and the hand, which is not religious but appreciates ritual, slowly relaxed and returned to service. He flexed fingers and felt in that small reprieve a wealth more reliable than coins. Good, he told the hand. Behave all day, and I'll forgive last night. On shore, I made the shack as if a guest were expected, and the guest, by coincidence, was my future self. Coils lay in obedient circles, the knife's edge found that small, bright honesty the stone keeps for the patient. I set the gourd to cool where the morning breeze remembers to pass. I read the box score aloud to the quiet room. A child's superstition, yes, but cadence is a tool, you use what you have. Then I walked to the beach and listened for a report from the horizon that never speaks. Even so, sometimes the skin hears what the ear cannot. He told me that when thirst should have made him foolish, he remembered to rinse his mouth first to teach the body not to be greedy. When hunger invited clumsiness, he answered with a sliver of albacore small enough to respect future hours. When fear suggested speed, he selected patience as if choosing a heavier oar for weather. He made one blunder the kind the sea permits only when it is in the mood to teach gently. He shifted his weight an inch too far, felt the bow resent it, corrected, and filed the lesson where such things are kept to be paid out later as prudence. Day rose like an accountant, exact and humorless. The fish had towed him far enough that home became a memory rather than a direction. He disliked the word luck, even when men used it kindly. He preferred words like current, depth, set. Still, he admitted to himself and to me that he wanted the day to be pleased with him. That desire, in him, never turned into pleading. He offered the day competence, and he hoped competence would suffice. There was a moment, he confessed it with an embarrassed shrug, when he loved the fish. I do not mean he forgot his purpose. He did not. He loved it the way a mason loves a wall that refuses to pretend it either stands or it does not, and the refusal compels your best work. Fish, he said softly, stay strong. The words, spoken aloud, changed nothing and changed him entirely. Respect rearranges a man so his strength lines up with his aim. I tried more worldly errands. I spoke with a man who boasted a shark knife so shiny you could see your poverty in it. I kept my mouth shut and spent my money on oil and a new file instead. I watched two boys argue over who had the better oarlocks and offered the heresy that the better rower has the better oarlocks. They groaned. The baker's daughter smuggled me a heel of yesterday's bread with more kindness than the law allows. I promised not to juggle it. I failed within an hour, and she pretended not to see. By late morning, heat trained its hard light on the water and on the thin place where shoulder, rope, and will met. He thought, as he often did when a task narrowed to a single bright thread, of the lions not as a spell, but as a temperature he could borrow. In that borrowed warmth, something eased. He did not close his eyes. He never closes them when work is underway. He told me he said I once, aloud, the small syllable a man gives to pain when it behaves itself. He disliked dramatics even from his own mouth, but the A escaped, and the fish, hearing nothing, towed on with the grave indifference of a planet. He tightened the pad on his shoulder. He rebalanced the rope across his back's truth. He breathed. And breathing, as he reminded me many times when he taught me to row beyond wanting, is the most honest way a person can agree to continue. When he allowed himself to imagine me suddenly crouched in the stern-handing water, steadying the coils, speaking the nonsense encouragements boys invent, he smiled and then drove the smile away as one shoos a gull from bait. I will bring him stories instead, he said, and that too he kept. He did not come home that day, of course, I made a bed on the shack floor and placed my palm on the mast as if one nerve could cross the distance. I told Sleep it could have me only in shallow water. Sleep agreed, and being Sleep, immediately lied. Outside, the sea made its single, patient argument against the sand, and the village practiced its mathematics of concern. I practiced the arithmetic of belief, and still, even with solitude shaped into discipline, even with pain taught to keep quiet hours, we wonder whether endurance by itself can finish the work, or whether a person must be answered, finally, by something other than his own unyielding will. He taught me that work, when it meets a worthy opponent, becomes ceremony, not spectacle, never charm, but a sequence of exact gestures that keep dignity from leaking out of the hands. Out there, with the great fish towing and the skiff consenting, he performed the sea's plain liturgy. Line across the shoulder, not on bare skin, but on a rag, because pain may be inevitable, but abrasion is a choice. Knees planted to the skiff's grammar. Breath slowed to the count. A rope understands. He did not play the fish as if for an audience. He kept company with it according to rites older than gossip. He let the fish taste the lower baits before he set his weight to the truth of the deep one. He had choreographed that order at dawn because a hungry creature deserves options and a serious fisherman deserves leverage. When the fish sounded, he yielded line the width of 3 counted knuckles, then 4, then stopped. And the stopping was precise, like the pause before the next bead of a prayer. When it rose, he gathered line without argument, using the body's architecture, back, legs, shoulders, so the hands could do the delicate labor of listening. He had shown me this 100 times on shore, with a bare rope and no fish. How to become a pulley that respects itself. He spoke short words to organize the room inside him. Kind to the right hand, which tends to pride. Behave to the left, which remembers cramp like a language it learned too well. Easy to the rope. Stay to the skiff. He made no speeches to the sea. He distrusts eloquence when balance is required. He offered the fish a phrase only once. Brother, he said, not because he believed in a blood relation, but because respect prefers a name to an it. Later he admitted he asked forgiveness in advance. For the gaff? I said. He nodded, not proud of the necessity, not apologetic for knowing it. There was food. He cut strips from the albacore he had earlier taken quickly, cleanly, the way one writes a note on a moving train, and ate them raw with water. Good, he told the day aloud, and the day, which had other business, allowed him that small agreement. He rinsed his mouth before swallowing to teach thirst its manners, and saved the onion for later because onions, like kindness, make better sense when the hour grows thin. He promised himself coffee, as a man promises himself a season he will not skip. He is not pious by profession, but he spoke a few Our Fathers and Hail Marys the way a craftsman oils a hinge knot to conjure miracles, to ensure motion. He kept score on his fingers, then forgot the count and did not feel guilty. Birds wrote marginalia on the water's page. A man-of-war bird hung high, tail tacking. Terns flicked their half-moons of attention. Petrels stitched the seam where currents slid like silk under coarser cloth. An agua mala, Portuguese man-of-war, sailed by, its violet bladder proud, its long stinging rags trailing malice. He disliked them, he did not swear at them. Hatred makes you clumsy. He shifted the line away and let the bad water go do its bad work elsewhere. By late morning the fish had learned his patience and he had learned its endurance. Each sounding felt less like escape and more like testing of rope, of bone, of the narrow treaty between them that the line translated without flourish. When the left hand remembered its old failure, it began to claw. He told it the small truth. You can be stone and still hold. He rested it, begged the right reliable, proud to carry more, and moved the rope a finger's breadth on the shoulder so pain would change its mind. These adjustments, so tiny a gull could not see them, were the ceremony's secret music. On shore I kept the counter-ritual, feeling vaguely fraudulent about the quietness of it. I scrubbed the bucket until it had nothing left to confess. I honed the small knife until it shaved paper, because the old man says a blade that will shave paper will stop lying to fish. I folded newspapers flat and set them as an extra blanket at the bed's foot. The poor have to use headlines for warmth and leave the news for daylight. I went to the terrace and argued credit for coffee I did not intend to drink, only to own against evening. The owner scowled elaborately and then pressed the measure into my hand with theatrical reluctance. "For your saint," he said, and I did not correct him. Saints are made by witnesses anyway. Between errands, life allowed itself ordinary jokes that keep solemnity from turning tyrant. The baker's daughter tried to teach me to juggle again. I kept 2 oranges aloft for 4 heroic beats, and then catastrophe announced itself with a thud. She applauded as if catastrophe were art, which may be the only true applause. A dog trotted past carrying a frayed length of rope, as though parading my vocation. A cat blinked in verdict. I practiced my lines for the night's box score names of men who solved their day with wrists and stubbornness, and promised the heir to read them later in a cadence the old man liked, steady and without glee. Out there, the sun went glassy and then went hard. He adjusted his belt, not from vanity but from geometry, so ribs and breath and effort would not argue. He imagined me in the stern, my clumsy water offering, my habit of saying good too often, and permitted himself a smile that he immediately folded away. He does not permit sweetness to make him inaccurate. He promised the fish a clean finish. He promised me stories. He promised himself nothing he could not keep. At noon, a school of flying fish scattered in panic, and a green-gold dolphin fish torpedoed through their glitter like a sentence underlining itself. He might have tried for it. But ceremony forbids greed. He stayed with the vow he wore like a harness. A cloud offered shade. He thanked it with his skin. The edge of rope carved its autograph on him deeper. He moved it 2 grains width toward the neck and gave the skin a future. He told me later there was a moment when he heard, through cord and bone, a different intention from the fisher, a slow rise, not resigned, not triumphant, but curious, as if the great thing wanted to learn what it had been pulling. He tightened nothing, he loosened nothing, he simply read, and reading is a sacred craft when the text can end you. The line took a truer angle. He whispered, "Come," and did not mean to command. He meant, "I am here." And then the fish showed itself. A shadow first, large as a rumour made true, then the long dark wing of a sickle tail, then the broad back lifting like a continent briefly mistaken for a wave. He measured it not with wonder, though wonder was there, but with the quiet arithmetic of a man setting a plank. Length, girth, the speed with which water fell away. He praised it under his breath and apologized again, softly. Admiration and intent can be neighbors if you keep a clean fence. The fish went down at once as if embarrassed by the disclosure. He gave line and then, counting breath, took line back. Ceremony resumed. He checked knots by touch, the clinch, the sheet bend he had tied months ago that today must testify. He felt no give. He approved the earlier craftsman with a nod the earlier craftsman would never see. I read the box scores aloud to the empty shack that evening, DiMaggio among them, that saint of wrists and sour heelin believed, because a boy needs something to believe that cadence can travel water. I set the coffee on the table, sweet beyond our means, so the room would smell like choice when he returned. I salted the onion, then laughed at myself and put it away. Salting an absent man's onion is theatrics. I carried a pail to the shore and listened for a skiff I could not hear. Night arrived with its ledger. Out there he ate the rest of the fish, rinsed his mouth like a man who remembers not to teach the next hour bad habits, and allowed himself a few inch-long sleeps that the rope permitted. He let the stars do their saint work, cold and exact. He borrowed a degree of warmth from the lions on the beach and paid it back by breathing evenly. When his left hand threatened mutiny again, he bribed it with a promise of coffee that would be earned, not begged. It agreed because hands unlike men remember favors longer than insults. He told me the last act of the ceremony would be brief when it came. A gaff is not a prayer, it is a period. He dreaded the sentence ending, even while he wanted the sentence whole. He planned each motion 6 moves ahead, the lashing of the line if the fish ran, the second gaff if the first set shallow, the lashing again if it leapt. He disallowed imagining the display on the beach. He despises parades. He imagined only work. I kept vigil, badly. Boys do. I meant to stay awake until the sea declared something to me personally. The sea, which is busy, did not. Sleep argued tenderly, and I surrendered with my hand on the mast as if a single nerve could be passed down a spar and out into the skiff we loved. And still, even as ritual steadies the blood and skill refines intention, do we not wonder whether ceremonies can protect meaning from the moment of necessity, or whether the instant the clean tool meets the living fact, some part of honor must step aside to let survival do its plain work. He told me the moment arrived without fanfare, which is how true moments prefer to arrive. The fish had shown itself once back like a dusky hill, sickle tail cleaving water with a mathematician's certainty, then returned to the deep as if private strength had blushed at being seen. After that came the long persuasion, the rise and sounding, the measured gifts of line, and the careful taking back, the kind words he spoke to hands that have their own temper. Sun altered its position from admonition to approval. The rope's hum steadied into the pitch of decision. He understood that the next time the Great One came up, it would not be to visit, it would be to answer. He prepared the skiff with the quiet bustle I have loved since childhood, the way a craftsman lays out his tools not to impress a crowd but to keep his own breath from stumbling. He shifted the line across the shoulder to fresh skin, tightened the knot whose name I had repeated to boredom on many afternoons, set the gaff within a palm's travel and cleared the thwart where the long body would lay if grace permitted. He said a brief prayer, not to purchase a favor, but to oil the hinge between nerve and motion. And then he leaned a fraction toward the bow, the way one leans toward a friend's next sentence. The fish rose as if the sea were presenting a thought in full. First the shadow again, then the broad back lifting, then the ridge of dorsal clean as a blade, and at last the head where the eye, he swears this, and I choose to believe him, held no malice at all, only the grave curiosity of a creature that has always gone forward. He did not cry out. He did not boast to the emptiness. He merely took the one step the ceremony had reserved, and the gaff set with a sound he still cannot describe, because there are sounds that belong to necessary acts, and we cheapen them by turning them into music. He apologized then, almost under his breath, and I think this is the place where our village gets the old man wrong. They imagine victory tastes like salt and glory. He says it tastes like duty and a small sorrow that must not be allowed to run wild. The fish trembled through the line's language, accepted the new grammar it had not chosen, and lay alongside in a submission that was not humiliation, but completion. He lashed it cleanly, the head, then the tail, then the midline, each knot an argument against waste, each turn of cord a vow to carry honor the whole distance home. He admired it without stealing from it, length beyond any he had handled, girth that promised meals for doors where hunger waits politely until spoken to, the long kingly bill that would make boys on the beach practice seriousness for a day and then return to games. He placed his hand on the marlin's dark, living flank. In that old gesture of thanks, his generation trusts more than speeches. He told it again that he was sorry for the hurt and grateful for the proving, not the adolescent proving that seeks applause, the adult kind that checks whether a man is still a place where his own word can safely sit. I know this hour by the way he washed it, in his telling no ornament, no convenient forgetting. He praised the fish as one craft praises another. Clean lines, honest force, no waste. He praised the rope that did not betray either of them. He praised his hands only to the extent that they had not made a fool of him. And then his mind, never one to loiter, went immediately to the afterwork, arranging the weight, balancing the skiff's center, calculating the long turn back toward a shore that now existed mostly as a future mood. From land, I sensed none of this by eye. The horizon held its secrecy, yet something in the air changed the way bakery air changes a street, subtle, persuasive. I argued for more coffee at the terrace and lost. The owner pushed an extra measure toward me anyway and barked at me to take it before he changed his mind, which is the exact way kindness wears its coat here. I wrapped a new onion in newspaper and felt ridiculous, then less ridiculous. There would be a time for onion. Behind the shop, the baker's daughter attempted again to teach me juggling. I kept 2 oranges aloft for 5 heroic beats, progress measured in fruit, and she clapped with the solemnity of a conductor indulging a novice. A dog trotted past with a stick that was too big for its pride and dropped it with a sound like a period. These are the errands that kept me from drowning in speculation. They are small and they saved me. He trimmed the sail, such as it was, to make peace between wind and burden. The fish rode alongside a long dark planet with its own weight of sea attending. He spoke to it more than once, not to comfort it, words do not travel through water that way, but to keep his own speech from hardening into silence. He promised to use it well. He promised not to parade it. He promised, with the obstinate modesty I recognize as the most beautiful thing about him, not to lie when telling the story later. He kept that promise, and it made the story slow. We will not be famous in the city for this kind of slowness, but I would not trade it. Turning home, he thought briefly of the beach when he was young, the lions playing, the sand answering underfoot, with that firm, forgiving give. He allowed himself the warmth of that memory for the length of 3 breaths, and then returned to rope, sail, weight, angle. When thirst asked for governance, he rinsed his mouth and waited. When hunger proposed he celebrate, he cut a modest strip from the small fish he had kept back and called it sufficient. He is the only man I know who can make sufficiency feel like hospitality. If this all sounds too grave, forgive me. Life persisted in its cheerful offences. A boy down the lane taught his dog to fetch coins from the surf, and for an hour the entire beach believed in the economy of miracles. The cat at the terrace claimed a stool, as if pronouncing judgment on whoever next sat there. I heard two men argue over the proper order of baiting sardine, squid, sardine, or the reverse, and their certainty delighted me, even while I stocked our own bait in the only order we could afford. What was fresh first? What was true second? I made a private promise to keep the knife so honest that if the day demanded speed, we would not lose time diminishing a good life with clumsy work. On the water, Mercy was brief and businesslike. He had tied the fish in a way that distributed pressure and honoured its shape. He kept the skiff quartering seas with more care than pride. He even let his mind trot a little way down the road of arithmetic. What the fish might fetch, which doors would open to the smell of broth, which debts would be pushed back another month without anger. But he cut that trot short. You do not spend a catch in your head. The sea hates accounting that leaps ahead of work. He told me he thanked God and then, almost in the same breath, thanked the fish again to keep his gratitude from becoming haughty. He is superstitious about nothing except pride. Pride, he says, is the only weather a man can choose. So choose the climate where gratitude breathes better. He put his palm to the marlin's side one more time and felt there a slow, stately energy like a hymn concluding itself. Brother, he said once more, not to bless or to excuse, but to bear witness. Then he faced forward, where the distance to home had not altered, but the terms had. You know what waits down current of triumph. He knew it too, though he did not name it aloud yet, because speaking a thing is sometimes to invite it to dinner. He checked the lashings, he moved a loop a finger's width. He told his left hand, which remembers disobedience like a favourite song, to be ashamed later and agreeable now. He felt the skiff accept the day's choice. I have been told by men who do not love him that he chased a spectacle. They are wrong. He chased competence and was furnished a spectacle against his will. When he told me of the final surge, the gaff's bite, the lashing, the bow's awkward pride, he spoke as a man reports weather exact, uninflected. The only ornament he allowed was the fact that he praised the fish before he hurt it. This is what I keep. To honour a thing is not to spare it. Sometimes it is to do necessary work without lying about what you take. Evening at last folded its darker cloth over the line of water. I read the day's box score to the empty roomy private liturgy and laid out a cup that would taste sweeter than our budget admits. I pictured his hands on the gunwale, that spare economy of motion that to me has always looked like prayer with sleeves rolled. I told the room aloud that he was on his way. The room, being a room, did not answer. It only smelled briefly of coffee and hope. And yet, for all the gratitude rightly spoken and the careful knots tied against loss, we still wonder whether thanks alone can guard a victory from the world's appetites, or whether every earned dignity must sooner or later pay its tax to the teeth time keeps sharpened in the dark. Evening had pressed its cool palm on the water, and luck, if you believe in such a word, after the work is done, had nothing left to say. He had the marlin secure alongside, the lashings neat, the bow trimmed to the new arithmetic. Turning home, he gave thanks in the plain way he knows. A hand briefly placed on the fish's dark flank, a private promise to use the gift without theatre. The sea, which approves of tidy vows, answered with silence. Then it wrote a correction in the margin. He told me later that the first messenger announced itself not by drama but by geometry. A shadow rose at an angle that does not belong to waves or honest chop. The line of water folded, then straightened. He felt, beneath the skiff, a new idea being added to the day's sentence. Before sight had its say, he had already moved the gaff within reach. The line shifted to spare skin, the old shoulders leaning a fraction toward balance. When the thing showed, it showed purely. Not a rumour, not confusion, a Mako, all business, that clean blue-grey precision some men admire too late. Out here they call it by the name fisherman news when they are frank and a little respectful. The Dentuzo, he disliked waste, he disliked drama, he disliked cruelty most, but he understood necessity, and the Mako kept a ledger different from his own. It had read the marlin's long proof in the water and chosen to claim a dividend. He gave it no speeches. He met it with the one tool he had for such arithmetic. The Gaffand, in that brief, exact exchange, took the tax collector's claim and told it no in the language of wood and iron. It was over as quickly as a period. He apologized aloud, he always does, even when no ear on earth can hear it, for what he had to refuse. The Mako slipped back into the sea's accounting, and the skiff steadied, but the hinge had swung. Iron was gone to the deep with the fish, and the air above the water no longer smelled only of salt and clean work. You know what follows when even a little blood speaks into a language the sea understands. He knew it too, before any fin wrote parentheses in the dusk. He secured what could be secured. He checked each lashing the way a craftsman more farther than fighter checks a sleeping child. He cut clean from the albacore to keep himself honest and his strength from arguing. Then he made a tool from what remained. His knife lashed to an oar with a knot his hands trusted, not because it was clever, but because it had been rehearsed in patient afternoons when the only audience was rope and buoy and the day's intolerance for sloppiness. I am not a man of the water yet. I am the boy who waited. From shore we did our evening's small theatre. Men compared catches. The terrace owner perfected his scowl and increased my credit by the spoonful. The baker's daughter pressed 2 oranges into my hands and forbade me to juggle them tonight. I promised, failed, and she pretended not to see, which is a mercy the poor can afford each other. A dog dragged a stick, half again its size, and learned that pride has a weight. The cat blinked like a magistrate. We laughed at ordinary things because ordinary things keep a village from being swallowed by its own forecasts. The horizon told us nothing of angles or corrections. I laid a blanket and set coffee to wait. I practiced steadiness by reading aloud the day's box score to a room that never interrupts. Out there, the corrections gathered. The second visitors were not artisans like the Mako. They were the other kind, the slab-nosed labourers who come when the sea opens a public door. He calls them galanos, shovel-nosed scavengers, and he speaks the name without contempt, only accuracy. They were doing what the sea had taught them to do. He had a different lesson to keep. They cut at the marlin's flank the way the night cuts day into pieces. He met them with the oar knife, clean strokes, not wild, taught by years of making small motions exact. He set his feet to the skiff's grammar, spoke a short word to each hand to keep pride from sprinting past skill, and held his breath to the count that respects both lungs and rope. He granted nothing to fury. Fury teaches clumsiness. He gave attention, and attention is a sharper blade. A pair broke off, then another came, then 2 together. He learned the rhythm of their confidence and answered with a rhythm of refusal, little like rowing, he said later, or like a craftsman insisting the cut follow the line instead of the wish. He was not impressed by himself. He was only unwilling to see the day's work erased by mouths that did not care how it had been earned. Even the best work has a budget. The knife edge dulled. The lashing drank salt and flexed. Shoulders announced invoices. He shifted, as he always does, 1 finger's width here, 1 inch there. The algebra by which he keeps pain under contract instead of kingship. He talked to the left hand, which remembered its old language of cramp and tried a few words. Not now, he told it without anger. He talked to the right, which sometimes overspends, and asked it to be generous without being a fool. He spoke once to the marlin not to be heard, but to keep himself honest and promised, as if promises could bind the water, that he would not let the world take morsels without earning them. From land, I felt, not a rumble, but the way a knight becomes mysteriously taller when it hosts a test. I brought the coffee cup to the doorway and then put it back without drinking. I remembered the ball player with the hurt heel and recited his name like a charm against foolishness. It is not a charm, I know, but certain names steady the wrist. I sharpened the spare knife until paper curled the poor man's candle and set it in the place where a returning hand would find it without looking. I told myself the sensible lie that a vigil helps. The sea did not agree or disagree. It continued its 1-syllable breath. Out, in. He said the first real grief of the night was not fatigue, but arithmetic. The Galanos took 2 generous bites before they learned respect. He chased them off and gained back water, but a perfection had been revised. He did not groan over the lost weight, though his body could count it. He mourned what he had hoped to carry whole to shore work, ungnawed, proof unqualified. He said I once, that small syllable a body gives to pain when it agrees to continue. Then he adjusted the lashing, retied a turn whose honesty mattered, and reminded himself that a man does not advertise sorrow to scavengers. The night thickened. The sea made and unmade intentions under the hull. He braced and lifted and refused. When 3 came at once, he changed the tactic. A short, firm thrust to discourage, then a second to persuade. He was not in love with the necessary contact. He did what clean work asked and saved his breath for the next correction. Each time he drove one away, another translated the lesson badly and tried again. He gave them the same sentence, unadorned, until even their slow grammar began to learn. There were likenesses, even here, because life insists. A pair of porpoises, those imprudent optimists, ghosted the bow for a minute as if to offer entertainment. He told them, almost laughing, to mind their own play. A small star fell and wrote its brief chalk across the dark. He permitted himself not to make a wish, because wish-making is a poor use of minutes when rope is speaking. He rinsed his mouth before swallowing the last of the water, not because he had time for manners, but because manners make time behave. Nearer home felt like a word more than a place more. The shovel-nosed ones came, and he met them until the oar-knife's lashing loosened, until the wood confessed it did not want to be a spear forever. He retied, paired the cord, made a new knot. He refused to be educated into panic. He gave short thanks for the clouds that cooled the work, and for the thin wind that let the skiff angle where it wished. He did not look behind to inventory the damage. He does not believe in studying loss, while you can still add to what remains. I will not paint the shore with torches and shouts. There were none. We are a poor village with ordinary candles and cautious throats. But a few of us stepped to doorways because the sea had begun to smell like a story. And villages, even tired ones, have noses for that. I held my breath for so long that breathing, when it returned, felt like extravagance. The baker's daughter touched my elbow and said nothing, which is the right language when boys have chosen worry as their occupation. I rehearsed aloud the names of knots to keep my mouth from prayer. Clinch, sheet bend, bowline. I promised the room that there would be coffee soon and apologized to the cup for lying. He did not arrive that night. He told me later that toward the last stretch he spoke to the marlin again and called it brother in the way men do when they have labored beside an equal. He told the sharks a firmer word. He told himself nothing fancy only, the next true instruction. When even the good blade became tired, he took up the club and turned refusal percussion. No flourish, no hatred, just work with its sleeves rolled higher than pride. Dawn, when it came, found everyone on honest terms. The skiff marked, the man cut and salt-stung, but upright, the marlin reduced to what bones can testify. He did not pretend this was victory's preferred face. He did not pretend it was defeat. He called it the truth and began to steer in a little closer to shore. On land, we learn to dress our feelings in whatever the hour can afford. I joked, very poorly, about my oranges. The baker's daughter laughed on purpose at nothing to keep my hands from shaking. The terrace owner swore at me and set out 2 cups instead of 1. We all performed the small, sturdy graces that keep a place from inventing a tragedy that hasn't happened yet. And still, for all the stern skill and the refusals taught to our hands, for all the clean blows given in defense of earned work, we wonder whether the world inevitably takes its portion of whatever we love, or whether there is a way to bring something home whole, without lying about the teeth that travel under every grateful wave. Morning arrived like a truth no one had chosen, and the skiff came without a familiar hull, escorted by an unfamiliar, astonishing length of white. From the dunes we first saw only the upright scythe of a tail, the blade of it cutting the light as if to harvest silence. Then the rest resolved, vertebrae bright as knuckle bones, ribs curved like a ruined harp, the long spearhead that once had worn muscle and now wore air. The old man guided the boat in without flourish. He did not look left or right. The sea said its last syllable against the keel and fell quiet. Fishermen do not gasp, they inventory. Someone fetched a stick and made marks along the sand, from snout to tail the way we measure sailcloth. Someone else counted the ribs aloud, then the vertebrae, tapping each bone with a respectful knuckle. They named figures, then corrected them, then stopped because numbers are shy in the presence of astonishment. A boy reached to touch. His father caught his wrist, not to forbid reverence, only to teach its order. I walked past them and into the skiff, which is to say, into the room where his small, intact life had worked all night. I said nothing. He nodded to me, and the nod held both apology and welcome. Up close, the story in his hands was older than skin. Cuts had written themselves in a script Salt understands. The rope had left its arithmetic in bruised sums across shoulder and back. His eyes, this is the part no one believes when I tell it, were not defeated. They were tired, which is a different country. I gave him the cup I had sweetened beyond our allowance. He drank as if tasting not sugar, but permission to remain upright. Good, he said, which is the sacred word the poor use when better words would embarrass the hour. The terrace owner, who boasts severity, like a medal arrived with a second cup and placed it without looking at anyone. The way a man lays a coin on a grave. He scowled at me for failing to drink mine before it cooled, and then scowled harder to keep from being thanked. People gathered and arranged their faces along the old axes: pity, admiration, calculation. Two boys, brave because boys must be, asked questions about sharks and hit each other's shoulders as if courage could be shared by impact. A woman crossed herself, another went home to tell the story first. Our village is poor in luxuries and rich in versions. I helped him out, and he moved as a man moves who has made a bargain with his joints. You carry me now, and I will let you curse me later. We hoisted the mast together. Again it felt like a cross that had learned our shoulders by heart. We carried it to the shack and leaned it where the wall remembers its shadow. Inside, the newspapers lay where I had flattened them. The knife was where I had left it. The gourd, half full, cool by its habit of choosing shade. He sat on the bed, and the bed said enough in its straw language. The room took him back the way a harbour takes back a boat, with scrape, with ease, without applause. I washed his hands with a rag I had dampened. The rag turned the colour of our work. He watched me as if memorising a lesson he had once taught me and could now forget without shame. I will get the head for Pedrico, I said, remembering the fish head the old man sometimes gave to a friend who turned scraps into soups that tasted of ceremony. He nodded. Do, he said, a word as short and sufficient as bread. He did not boast about the fish. He did not defend what the sharks had taught the day to take. He lay back and let his eyes find the beam where dust kept a private weather. I went out to the beach with a length of rope and the authority of need. Men were arguing the precise count of inches and hands. I walked past them to the skull and the long spear and claimed what had been promised by our custom, the head for Pedrico, a coil of line promised to me, and, if there was decency left in the world, a future day for the old man's dignity. The men were not cruel, only noisy. I loaded what I could and left the rest to their measurements. A tourist couple had appeared, tidy as postcards. The woman pointed and asked a waiter from the terrace what kind of fish that was. Shark, he said, lazy with the pleasure of being asked. He is not wicked, he is human. The woman nodded a lesson to herself she will misremember. I wanted to correct the story and didn't. Some corrections are better offered in silence and in time. Lightness, because life refuses to be edited by tragedy. The baker's daughter pressed an orange into my palm with a look that said I was forbidden to juggle it, which I obeyed for a full minute. The cat at the terrace appropriated the empty chair meant for the owner and performed a nap of such ceremony that the whole street lowered its voice. A dog nosed the marlin's bleached rib and sneezed, offended by holiness. These small rebellions against solemnity are the village's way of refusing to drown on dry land. Back at the shack, I found him asleep on his face like a boy who has fallen across his desk. I laid the blanket over him and the newspapers over the blanket, because doubledness is how the poor imitate luxury. Then I sat at the door and read aloud the box score in the steady cadence he likes. A great player had played great again on a heel that hates duty. I wanted that to mean something more than it does. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it only kept my voice from breaking. Visitors came as they always do when a story has happened to someone else. A few entered and stood in the doorway, practicing the face they believed the moment required. I let them. One man tried a joke about luck and stopped mid-sentence because the room had arranged itself to reject that kind of air. Another offered money for the skeleton, as if bone were merely a ledger of weight. I told him to ask the owner of the beach, and he went away, injured that poverty had not begged him. The terrace owner returned, left food we could not afford, and fled before gratitude reached him. Grace likes to wear a disguise. When he woke, the first thing he asked was not for praise but for the particulars. What had been measured, what had been said, whether I had eaten. I lied expertly about the last, and he believed me, which is the sort of forgiveness a boy neither deserves nor forgets. He turned on his side, and his face, relieved of duty for an hour, looked suddenly very young. "We will fish together," I said, and it was not a boy's vow this time. It was a clause in a contract ratified by bone and salt, and the kind of love that refuses to be romantic because it wants to be useful. "Yes," he said, "we will." He closed his eyes and smiled in the secret way that belongs to the country where lions play. Evening walked down the street, tidying the heat. I carried the fish head to Pedrico and settled a debt I hadn't counted. Boys watched with the open hunger of apprentices and thieves. Someone along the shore had strung a line to keep dogs off the bones, but dogs are better readers than string and respected it without understanding it. Tourists passed and took polite shock into their cameras. One asked again, and the waiter said again, "Shark," and was wrong again. I considered our poverty of correctives and decided work would have to argue for us later. At last I returned and set my chair by his bed. He slept as men sleep after having kept company with the sea's exactness, long, without twitching, without mercy for those who would like to talk. I counted the breaths the way one counts strokes when rowing, except that now I rowed nowhere, and counting was only a way to keep my hands from doing something foolish, like reaching into the past to fix what the night had already written. I arranged the coils for morning. I sharpened the knife until it asked for no more attention. I set 2 cups by the door. I told the room, which is patient with announcements, that tomorrow we would begin again. For the sake of modest comedy, let me confess, I ruined the solemnity by attempting one last bit of juggling in the lane with 2 oranges and a heel of bread. I failed magnificently, and the baker's daughter applauded as if I had meant to perform a fall. We laughed in the soft way people laugh when there is sleep in the house and honor trying to rest. And yet, for all the counting of bones and the small economies of kindness, for all the promises spoken over coffee and newspapers, we still wonder whether a village can learn to measure a man by the proofs he brought home in himself, rather than by the meat the world allowed him to keep. There is a way a village settles after astonishment. The first day belongs to rumour and measurement. The second belongs to chores. I woke into the second day with the old man's quiet still braided into my ribs. Outside, the street had resumed its careful economy buckets to wells, loaves to tables, debts to their rounds, but our shore kept a new punctuation mark. The marlin's spine lay white and articulate along the sand, vertebrae like a counted rosary, the blade of the tail making even the morning light seem newly cut. I went to look before anyone else could turn it into a lecture. The bones said nothing, which I took for wisdom. I brought coffee back to the shack and found him sitting up, hair obedient to salt, eyes as clear as they had been before numbers tried to tell us who he was. He drank, and we said little, because the day after requires quieter words than the day of. I told him what men had claimed in the terrace, how someone swore the fish measured from the doorway of one house to another, how another claimed more ribs than a fish has ever deserved. He smiled, and the smile had no appetite for correction. He has always preferred facts to triumph, and the fact was that the fish had come, had been honored, and had been taxed by the world. "We will fish together," I repeated, not as consolation but as schedule. He nodded, and that nod felt to me like a rope set right across a thwart. There were errands to pay our respect forward. I carried the head to Pedrico, who makes a soup that tastes like forgiveness. I bartered for new cord and a modest hook to replace a prideful one I could not afford. And I bought flour I did not need to have a reason to see the baker's daughter. She sold me a heel of bread and a sentence about the weather, and told me with her eyes not to juggle in doorways when old men are sleeping. I obeyed for an hour, which is nearly a record. A dog escorted me down the lane with a stick that was clearly his first philosophy. The cat on the counter blinked a benediction I could not earn. After chores, I tidied the shack into the kind of order that refuses despair. Coils lay in obedient circles, the knife confessed, along the stone until paper curled. And the newspapers were smoothed as if warmth could be flattened into them by will. He let me fuss, which is love's way of being useful when it can't be glorious. I asked him to show me again how he had set the baits at 4 distances 40-60 deeper, and he traced the air with 2 fingers, naming not luck but method. Depth, he said. Current. Evidence. I repeated the words the way a novice repeats a creed, not because he understands mystery, but because he wants to stand where truth has been standing longer than he has been alive. The terrace, meanwhile, manufactured versions for export. Tourists arrived with their small thirsts, and a waiter, who is a friend of mine, when nobody is watching, called the bones shark again. I did not correct him. You cannot fix every sentence a stranger mispronounces. You can only build a better sentence with your life and trust that someone will learn to read. Still, as I passed, I laid a hand for a moment on the bright ridge of bone and thought a stubborn thought. That honor can be measured in what remains when use and accident have taken their legal portion. When I returned, he had fallen asleep and woken into the country of lions again. He did not say so. He did not need to. The room grew warmer by a degree, even though the door stood open. "Tell me," I asked, when he blinked himself back to us, "one thing from the sea I have not yet learned to read." He glanced toward the window, where the line of morning was already a memory. "Learn how your hands speak to each other," he said. "They are worse gossips than gulls." I flexed the left, which remembers cramp like a native tongue, and promised to teach it kindness. He nodded, pleased by a vow, with work in it. We walked to the beach together afternoon. Not for display, but for bearings. Boys trailed us and pretended not to. Men whose jokes had been sharp 2 days ago wore their duller faces today, as if their mouths had remembered that dignity sits more easily on quiet. We stood beside the skeleton and took in the way the sea had already begun to blur its edges with salt. "We do not bring everything home," he said mildly. "No," I answered, "but we bring back the part that chooses us." He glanced sideways the way he does when he is trying not to smile and failing. "You talk too much," he said. "I learned it from you," I said, and he laughed once. The small syllable that makes room for truth without inviting a crowd. I know you want me to admit sorrow weighed more than pride that day. Perhaps it did before breakfast. By afternoon, the balance had learned a better posture. I began to understand what the old man means by a Nora word men misuse when they want applause. Honor, in his grammar, is the unfancy habit of being equal to your tools and your task, even when the day edits your intention with its own pen. It is praise spoken to a fish before you harm it, and apology spoken after, and a refusal to hate what cannot hear. It is cleaning the knife when no one is looking. It is the yes you keep giving to a craft that does not promise to love you back. There were likenesses because there must be. A boy challenged me to race from the ribs to the tail and lost when my feet remembered the skiff's quick grammar. The baker's daughter clapped once and called me Fisher of Sand, which is affectionate mockery of the only survivable kind. A gull stole my bread and I swore in a whisper that would have earned me a cuff at home. The old man pretended to be deaf and then fined me 1 orange, which he ate with the scrupulous ritual of a king whose kingdom is small and perfectly governed. Toward evening, I read him the box score, which is a liturgy we keep on days that threaten to go theatrical. The great ball player had played well again, heel conspiring against him, yet offered no quarter. Wrists answered with diligence. "He plays hurt," I said, offering the line like bread. "All the good ones do," the old man answered, neither self-pitying nor proud. We sat a while in that decent weather men make with few words. I mended a small tear in the sail-paw cloth, pretending to be a wing, and he watched the needles pass, as if it were a boat in miniature finding a better wind. I asked him, finally, what we would change before morning, and he surprised me by naming almost nothing. A better edge on the gaff, if the sea ever lets us keep one. A fresh lash for the club, more onion, if commerce remembers we exist. The rest, he said, is the same work. I wrote a list that would make no sense to anyone who believes change must be large to count. Sharpen, splice, fold, read, rinse, rest, eyes. If you have never loved a craft, the list will look like boredom. If you have, you will see it for what it is, a staircase. We spoke too of the village, of how boys learn what to admire from the jokes men choose and the silences women keep. I said I wished they would measure him by the clean line he had kept taut through pain, rather than by the meat the world allowed him to carry home. He shrugged, teaching once more by refusing to be edited by applause. "People count what they can eat," he said. "We can teach them to taste other things, but not by scolding." So I planned lessons that do not look like lessons, a coil laid perfectly where the whole street can see. A knot tied slowly and right in the presence of those who hurry. A story told with no boast and all the work included. Before bed, I tried one careful bit of juggling in the alley with 2 oranges and a tin cup. Predictably, disaster. The cup rang against stone and the oranges rolled under the cat, who chose that moment to become sacred and untouchable. The old man laughed softly from the doorway and told me to save magic for days that don't need it. We closed the shack with the modest sounds of a house putting itself straight. What remains now is simple and therefore difficult. We will go out together. We will set baits at their honest depths. We will speak to our hands and teach them the calm grammar of cooperation. We will praise what is worthy and apologize when we must take from it. We will come back with what the day allows and make soup that tastes like decency. And if a boy asks me what honor is, I will point to a coil of line done properly and to an old man's eyes that are tired but undefeated. And I will say, this is how you keep from becoming smaller after a loss. And still, even as we practice these small, faithful gestures and ask no theatre of the sea, we wonder whether a village that counts flesh can learn to count the invisible weight a man brings ashore, or whether honor must remain a private currency, spent mostly in the silence between a breath and the next true task. I woke before the room had decided to be morning, and lay listening to the little negotiations a house makes with light. The old man's breath kept even time. and the newspapers rose and fell over his shoulders like a second tide. I could have stayed there, hoarding quiet, but vows need errands, or they go thin. I slipped out, closed the door softly, and walked the lane without waking the dogs who believed themselves to be locks. At the terrace, the owner practiced his scowl and slid me the coffee we could not afford. I bought an onion he oversalted with pity and accepted both without theatre. On my way back, I passed the bones on the sand. The ribs made their unchanged music-proof with nothing left to argue. I touched the blade of the tail with 2 fingers, as if ringing a bell that invites only work. He was sitting up when I returned, eyes exact, the way the sea looks when the wind minds its manners. "We go," I said, "no trumpet in it." "Yes," he answered, and the words sounded like a knot pulled true. We ate something small because small food is a better teacher than celebration. I sharpened the hook by the door until paper curled, and he watched with the satisfaction of a man seeing a sentence completed in the hand of his student. We spoke the day's list under breath: bait, coil, gaff, if the sea lets us keep one, club lash, water, the baseball scores for luck not luck, which is to say, for steadying rhythm. Outside the bones lay white and articulate, and a pair of boys ran the length between snout and tail, arguing inches they would forget by dusk. A woman, seeing me with the old man, made the sign she keeps for storms and weddings. The baker's daughter, her cheek clean for once, gave me 2 oranges and forbade juggling with a look I had begun to translate. I confessed that her bands only make my hands itch. She threatened to charge me by the bruise and then laughed, and the laugh put a small lantern in my chest. A dog appeared with a stick the size of its hope and tried to add itself to our crew. We promoted it to shore officer, a rank paid in crumbs. These foolish mercies do not compete with seriousness, they keep it from becoming proud. We moved the mast the short distance from wall to shoulder, and it remembered us. It has learned our bones the way a hymn learns the throat. He took the heavier share without drama. I took the eager share without apology. At the door he hesitated by that fraction that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with precision. I watched the pause as a boy watches a teacher's hand above chalk. He stepped, and we stepped into the lane's thin gold. The skiff waited, wearing yesterday's scrapes like clean scars. I will not sell you prophecy. Some mornings turn themselves to miracles. Most mornings want mended nets, an honest edge, and breath counted so the hands do not outrun the lungs. We pushed out. The water's first cold admitted us with its ordinary baptism. He rowed with that spare grammar that makes each stroke look inevitable. I faced forward and read the surface for italics. A bruise colour that meant weight. The silver scribble of bait far off. The little seam where a different temperature walks under ours and refuses to wave. He asked for the 40-fathom bait without looking. I passed it as if it had existed in my hands since my birth. He smiled privately, and that was my first catch of the day. We said little. He dislikes speech that tries to coach luck, and I have grown suspicious of eloquence where balance should be. I asked about cloud feathers. He tilted his chin and let silence answer, a change sometime later, not soon enough to insult the afternoon. I asked the left hand to behave, and it considered, then agreed, perhaps because I bribed it with a promise of coffee. When a man-of-war bird hung high, tail trimming like a miser's pen, I marked the place and did not move our plans an inch. He taught me that evidence is not a leash, it is a map you hold, while remembering the land could change. We ate a sliver from yesterday's fish, the smaller one kept aside for decency. and he rinsed his mouth before swallowing, instructing thirst to keep hours. He said one Our Father, not to hire a miracle, but to oil habit. I noticed that his eyes, which the village had tried to calculate, still kept their sea weather, cheerful when measured by truth, unbroken by opinion. I felt for the first time without embarrassment the shape of a sentence inside me. I am his boy and his partner, both they. I did not speak it aloud. The skiff would have rolled its eyes. By mid-morning, the sea had given us only its grammar no more. I saw in that the day's intention to confirm that the clean work continues even after a tale has tempted a place to make a parade. We adjusted the lines by counted knuckles, checked the knots whose names I can now recite backward, and let patience do the thing it does when the body keeps moving. You will want to ask whether my hope had a size. It did not. It had a stance. Shoulders set, breath even, hands courteous to each other. He approved of the stance with a nod, small enough to pass for weather. When we turned back, it was not refusal, it was punctuation. Work is a sentence. Some days you bring home a clause that ends in a comma. The beach saw us as it sees everything, with eyes that judge quickly and histories that judge slowly. He walked the mast home in that unflattering light of noon, and the dogs made way like clerks learning to respect a signature. We ate onion and bread with a care that would have made a richer table blush. I read the box score in the cadence that steadies time. He closed his eyes, and I knew precisely where he had gone. I warmed the room by 1 degree with my thinking, and let him keep the beach where the lions don't grow old. Now comes the part with fewer facts and more choosing. In days after, I learned to see how the village will remember him. Some say salau with pity, trimmed to sound like instruction. Some wave their hands and measure bone with door frames and never find the same number twice. A few, fewer than I want, recognize the weight he brought ashore in his own body, the rope's arithmetic written on shoulder and back, the refusal to hate what cannot hear, the careful apology given to a noble fish. I do not have the leisure to argue everyone into better memory. I have a better task, to become a sentence that does not require correction. So I teach with errands, I set coils so clean that boys stop pretending not to watch. I tie a clinch knot slowly, an act of treason against hurry. I keep a blade honest. When a man calls the bones a shark, I do not waste my throat. I go to sea and come back with decency salted onto an ordinary day. When a child reaches to touch the white spine, I say, gently, and let his father see in my face that gentleness is not softness but proportion. I save money for a gaff we may keep for an hour and sharpen the old club's lash because sometimes hours are what we get. I love a girl who forbids juggling and defies sometimes, so she will keep forbidding me. This is how a small place keeps a joke alive. What I am learning and will keep learning is that honor does not descend once and live forever like a gull on a roof. Honor is made of repeated obediences to things no one sees, water rinsed from a mouth before swallowing, pride unlaced before it swells, praise given to what is worthy before you must take from it, apology placed after without drama, tools put away so tomorrow will not inherit your sloppiness, hands taught to speak kindly to each other so a cramp does not become a tantrum. If a boy asks me for a definition, I will give him a job. If a man asks, I will give him a silence that holds a list. Toward the close of that first day, fishing together again, we sat in the doorway while heat withdrew thread by thread. A gull wrote its little accent across the margin of sky. The cat at the terrace claimed a chair with its ordinary tyranny. The dog discovered the philosophical limit of its stick. He told me, not as a moral, but as an inventory, what we had done right and what we would do the same. Tomorrow, he said, and the word asked for no witness. I answered yes, and my yes had the shape of a coil done properly. We turned down the lamp. He lay back, newspapers over blanket over ribs, and I settled on the floor where the sea can find my feet in dreams. He smiled not for me, not for anyone, but because his private country had mailed him its familiar weather. I could almost hear paws in sand where no one is old. I thought of the marlin's eye, how he swore it held no malice, only grave curiosity, and I hoped to keep such a gaze for my own days, to meet what comes without borrowing hatred. Across the room, the mast's shadow reached the doorframe and paused, like a visitor who knows when to go and when to remain. If you have travelled with me this far, I ask only this. Keep some kindness for the work that ends in commas. Not every return can parade its meat. Some returns bring back only a way of standing, a steadiness of breath, a cleanliness of hands. If you see a boy straighten a coil for no audience, praise him with your silence. If you meet an old man whose eyes are tired but not defeated, measure him by the rope's song he still remembers, not by what the world allowed him to keep. And if one night you find that your own life has left you with bones bright as a truth nobody asked for, remember to lay a hand on them, give thanks without theatre, and sleep. Because after all, well, we still wonder whether a life can be judged by what it carries home or by the proof it carries within, and perhaps the sea, patient and exact, keeps its answer in the breath between a cast and the next honest pull. If you listen very softly, you may hear a young lion running where sand forgives every step, and an old man smiling without witnesses, and a boy myself, whispering an invitation no louder than the tide. Keep thinking about what makes a person whole.